Thank you all so much. I'm the tiniest bit embarrassed to be moderating a panel with people who are so much more distinguished than myself. Sitting here among three people who have been presidents of universities, a couple of them more than one university. The one who was president of only one university also spent time as lieutenant governor of a state. And then the only folks here, other than that, just happened to be a member of Congress who now becomes president of one of America's most important Jewish organizations. So I just want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank the summit for hosting us and for flying out a poor associate dean from a law school in Missouri to be here. And maybe it's perhaps because I'm the only one working on a campus right now for my full-time job that I'm semi-qualified to moderate here. So I want to start the discussion with something that may be the tiniest bit controversial, because what else should you do in a room full of Jewish people discussing sensitive matters? The topic of this talk is the crisis on campus. And I went to college in what might be described as perhaps like the golden age for American Jews on college campuses. But you know, I've been around and I've read some books, and people tell me that there used to be a lot of problems for Jewish people in the not too distant past on college campuses with explicit quotas, and then in the absence of the quotas with very chilly reception, and you know, the fancy fraternities wouldn't take Jewish people and so on, so we had to invent our own fraternities and things of that nature. So my question for the panelists is there a crisis on American college campuses, or are there problems we need to pay attention to, but crisis is the wrong word?
I'll start because I'm Jewish. My mother used to tell me, I grew up in the South Bronx, and we had a significant interaction with the Jewish community, and then it got more complicated. You don't make a mountain out of a molehill because it hurts more when you fall off a mountain. As far as I can tell, we have a problem, but it's not a crisis. I've been through crises on campus. It's really different than this because you don't debate during a crisis. You act during a crisis. This is something that has to be discussed and debated. That's what colleges and universities are for. And kids on campuses are supposed to be there screwing up. They make mistakes. They don't understand. They don't feel the need to be educated. They really want to act out in all sorts of ways. And that's what we're seeing. So I would say we got a problem. But as Ben pointed out, there's always been problems for Jews on campus. We have a problem that's manageable. The trouble is there are a lot of people who are being paid to hype it, to make it a mountain, because when you fall off, you really can hurt yourself.
You know, I think there are serious dynamics that are problematic on college campuses right now, but I'm probably given, like Alan, more in a calmer approach to things. I don't like to use the rhetoric of crisis or emergency on campus, but there are serious things that are happening right now on our campuses. I think that the way in which identity politics has played out on campus make this a particularly challenging moment. I think that a sense on campuses of almost a therapeutic expectation of how problems will be solved or how students will be taken care of has also created a mounting pressure right now that is difficult for schools to solve. But I think maybe most importantly, we're in a moment where the profound political and social and cultural cleavages in the country are also playing out as they always do on college campuses. And we have seen this happen before, and we've seen colleges and colleges and universities be in the middle of moments of where they're sort of the target of lots of anger. And historically, we have worked our way through that, and I want to believe that we're going to do that again. So that's why I don't immediately jump to the crisis rhetoric.
Does anyone want to say, yes, there's a crisis, or should I ask a different question?
I would say that there's a crisis of being able to have open and frank discussions about complicated topics on college campuses. And among those is anti-Semitism. And I believe there has always been anti-Semitism on campuses. And I think that it never went away. And so now, in this environment, suddenly there had become protected groups and protected ways of thinking and talking about society and our values that were absolutely unchallengeable on most college campuses. And because it was unchallengeable, a lot of the silent prejudices, the things that weren't being said, the groups that weren't being protected, were falling behind. And those prejudices, those silent prejudices, were being allowed to proliferate and being supported, again, quietly. And then suddenly, after October 7th, I do think that the cover was ripped off a lot of these discussions. Again, subtly, in terms of what people emphasized in their statements after the attack, or what they didn't emphasize, or that they said something or they didn't say something. And then suddenly the comparisons began to emerge. And this has been where the notion of a crisis is that this is a moment of realization. It's a moment of really reckoning for our universities, and we have to think about how we treat everyone on campus and protect everyone's voice and everyone's identity.
Yes, there's a crisis on our campuses. And I want to, and I respectfully, when Israeli students are chased across a campus screaming that Israelis do not belong here, that's a crisis. When Jewish students don't feel comfortable walking across the quad on their university campus because people are screaming, "Gas the Jews" at them, that's a crisis. When university presidents believe that it's difficult to just acknowledge in university presidents of prestigious universities at a congressional hearing, when they can't acknowledge that calls for genocide against the Jewish people is something that they should at least take seriously, yes, that's a crisis. Our own data, AJC's data, which we do a survey every year, close to 50%, 44% of college students in our recent survey have either changed what they wear, where they go on campus, what they carry with them, so people don't know that they're Jewish, or feel afraid in certain places on campus, and hesitate speaking out about, not even speaking out about Israel, just talking about Israel. This one, and this is, and I did not really expect the conversation to go like this, but I'm so glad that it has, because this is exactly the issue. On so many campuses, what AJC is told, and we engage on campus with university presidents around the country, what we're told is, well, college kids, college is a place where we're supposed to have tough discussions, and that freedom of speech matters, and I couldn't agree more. But when your policies, when you refuse to enforce your own codes of conduct, and the result of that is that you are silencing Jewish students, you're not going to have what you claim to want.
Let me just comment on this. You are right that there's a hesitancy, but there's also a law, and there's also the purpose of universities. What college presidents can't do is something that's going to come back and bite them, okay? Because politically, that's just stupid. So what they tend to do is to deal with a constituency which is extraordinarily diverse. There are hate crimes that happen. People say, kill the Jews. That's the same thing as killing the blacks. It's not acceptable, period. Period. But when they say, we don't like you, hell, I've been told like they don't like me so many times I can't stand it. It's okay not to like me, but you're not going to kill me. You're not going to threaten me, and that's the problem we're facing.
Let me sneak in then, because a couple people made references to statements, what kind of statements a university is making. And I work at a university where my system president has essentially said he's getting out of the statement business, right? He didn't make a statement about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That doesn't mean he was in favor of it. He doesn't make statements about one thing or another. So when the time came for people who wanted statements about Israel, he said, I'm happy to do anything I can do to help the Jewish community, but I'm not in the statement business because I'm not qualified to opine on every single thing in the universe, and there's all sorts of horrible things in the world. I don't make statements about the Uyghurs in China, et cetera. And I know there's a huge diversity of opinion about when universities should make statements speaking on behalf of the institution about major issues that are not happening on campus. I mean, obviously, if it happens on campus or in our town, that's very different. But particularly for the folks, the three of you who've been college and university presidents, When do you think it's appropriate to say, I have a big microphone and I want to use it? And I know you've done scholarship, you're writing a book on this very question.
So I am in the middle of writing a book on this question. I think that the moral, wise approach for universities here is to start with what's your mission. What do you put on earth here to do, okay? And in doing that, universities also need to be very mindful of the social compact that exists between them and broader society. At some level, universities exist to be, disruptive and interesting and innovative forces in society, but we're only allowed to do that because we get benefits and support from broader society. When you think about what your mission is, when you think about the nature of the social compact, I believe that more often than not, universities should make a choice to be reticent on issues that are not fundamentally educational, that are not really tied to their mission. Now, there are both philosophical and practical reasons for that. Philosophically, you don't want to impede on the academic freedom of other members of the community if the institution itself takes a stance. Practically, once you start taking stances, you immediately find yourself drawing down the kinds of slippery slopes that you were just talking about a few moments ago, Ben. But I do think that there are circumstances where it is right for universities to take a stance. If it's about an educational matter, if it's about something that relates to the university's ability to actually carry out its mission, if it relates to the preconditions, the academic freedom, the commitment to scientific inquiry that are necessary for the university to do its job, if the existence of the university itself were truly threatened, then you speak out. But more often than not, on a matter of foreign policy, it wasn't smart for universities or right for universities to take a stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Generally speaking, universities aren't put on earth to have foreign policy or tell the world what morality should be, but that is still different from saying what universities should provide in terms of support and the climate that they create on their own campuses for intellectual discourse. That universities are responsible for.
Kerry, what do you think?
Yeah, and I would take it a step further than that. I do think it's fine for college presidents to remain neutral or step back in most cases in terms of their own statement on behalf of the institution. However, I don't think it's okay if they then just go in their house and do nothing. I think it's extremely important that they then say, here is this really critically important event that's happening in the world. You're an educational institution. You have a duty to educate. So then you need to bring the different voices to the campus, make sure that people feel safe, to your point, to participate, to learn, to express their opinion in a civil way, certainly not to assault anyone, and to make sure that that campus climate is safe for that kind of learning. That's what colleges were made for.
Well,
That's the purpose. So you can't just say, look, it's better if I don't say anything, and then just go home and hope that the professors do what they should do, because in truth, we've been selecting our professors year after year on narrower and narrower criteria and ideologically, and so that's not going to happen naturally anymore on a college campus, that you can have that healthy give and take.
Yeah, so let me turn to Ted in 1 second. An example of that is, this fall, we have a professor at the law school at Mizzou who used to be a U.S. Navy lawyer, and he did some work in some of the terrorist tribunals in Guantanamo and so on. And he put on a panel that I moderated on Israel, Gaza, and the law of war. And it was actually a useful discussion, and people came and learned stuff. So just for what it's worth, it can be done. People at universities are capable of talking about difficult things. Not everyone is capable of it all the time.
And it should be done.
Yeah. Ted, you were waiting.
Thanks. I do believe, as I said before, that universities are places where people should be able to discuss difficult things. I also acknowledge that university presidents should be thinking about whether their statement impacts the purpose of the university. And I would just point out, Harvard is not the only university in America that has Veritas in its crest. And at a moment that required moral clarity, I wish, and I think everyone here would agree, I wish that on 10-7 and 10-8, that there wouldn't be a need for a statement, because everybody would understand the horrific nature of the slaughter of 1,200 people and taking hundreds more hostage. But it was on college campuses first, not, let's be clear, not when the IDF sent their brave soldiers into Gaza to defend the state of Israel and the Jewish people. But that very night and the next day, 10/8, on college campuses, there were protesters marching in support of Hamas. We believe that if a university is going to live up to everything that it sets forth as its mission, that when people are out in the streets marching in support of the most horrific day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, that it is important to show moral clarity, to set the tone for what that university campus is going to mean for Jewish students and for everyone else.
Al.
I like to say, when I was president of Queens College in New York, I had more Jewish students than Brandeis has students. And we took it incredibly seriously. We took the safety and security and peace of mind of our students incredibly seriously. But that's all students, okay? What Hamas did was inexcusable, worse. It was terror. And we have made clear that no matter where terror occurs, we oppose terror. And we will sanction terror to the extent we can. But we can't sanction speech. We have to be really, unless somebody is a hate speech, I will kill you, you're gone. But if they say, it's just very difficult to draw the line. And public universities, you got to be really careful. When we're dealing with BDS, I was at the City University of New York, the union, which represents, 60,000 people, said, we support BDS. And the chancellor of the City University of New York, who is a good friend of mine, said, look, in New York it's illegal. So we don't do that stuff. And that's all he had to say. So you have to be kind of careful and nuanced, because there's a constituency out there that's somewhat diverse, and there are real constraints that oppose.
I just want to say one thing. If I acknowledge all of that, but when you say that people shouldn't be allowed, they're barred from saying we're calling for murder, right? You can't march and say that, right? Is that right?
Of course not.
Right. But when you're out marching in support of the group that just carried out mass murder, that's the moment to speak up. And if you can't, as a university president, at that moment, stand up and call exactly that out and point out what enforcing your own rules are for those students who are marching in support of murder, then you're doing a disservice not just to the Jewish students on campus, but to the entire campus community.
So let me link back to the really, really informative panel we had earlier on following money and sources of money and so on. Because at least some of what we're seeing on college campuses that are particularly egregious is the result of funding from people who have nothing to do with our students and our staff and our faculty and so on. And while you always want to be hesitant to say that a group of people who are speaking up in favor of civil rights are just, quote, outside agitators or have been stirred up, there actually is some outside agitation that is happening. And so I'm interested to hear from the panel when you think universities should shut down groups that are behaving in ways that are egregious, because there is some risk of creating sort of more attention for a group than they would have if you just kind of ignored them. There's also First Amendment issues on our public institutions and semi-First Amendment issues, not real First Amendment issues, but free speech commitments on our private institutions. So, and perhaps it would be useful to think of concrete examples that don't relate to Israel. So if any of you in your experience as university presidents have had to shut down student groups or groups on campus because they violated your rules, because it's always nice, and I say this as a law professor, it's nice to be able to think, this is not the first time this problem has ever shown up, right? The issue of anti-Israel speech, that's not the first time we've ever had bad behavior on a campus. So have any of you shut a group down? And,
I'll take a shot at this. So I'm a pragmatist. I want to make sure that I do what's right by my institution and make sure that people can learn and achieve or do their scholarship and achieve what they came to the university to do. I've shut down fraternities, but I've shut them down for violation of the university's rules. If you destroy property, if you haze someone, if you violate standards of conduct, we're going to go after that, okay? In my experience, efforts to literally shut down speech just because it is speech tend to blow up. They tend to create martyrs for free speech. They tend to create a very different dynamic on campus where all of a sudden people are screaming about the university impeding someone's ability to express their own views. Practically speaking, it's not an effective response unless there's been real conduct, in which case you go after it. But I would say that part of how you can sometimes square the circle here is that it is very rare to find a circumstance where conduct and speech don't mix to some extent. Tearing down somebody's poster outside their room might be speech, but it's also destruction of property. It's conduct. You know, harassing someone, literally assaulting them, threatening them is also conduct. You can go after that. So I don't think that, generally speaking, banning groups in the abstract or just for pure speech is an effective response. You go after the conduct instead.
I also have shut down fraternities for endangering people, for assault, for theft, and all of these things violated our values as an institution. And I think that that's the real answer here, is that you have to have a clear set of values for your institution, and you have to measure every group's conduct against those values, and they all need to be treated the same. So obviously, to your example, if someone is advocating genocide, if they are celebrating murder, then this is not conduct becoming any college student.
I mean, this is
And
SJP.
that should be.
This is SJP.
So to follow up then, anyone who's been paying attention to the news at all knows of examples of really egregious behavior by groups on campuses which have either an actual campus affiliation or a loose affiliation with a campus. So people who are banging on library windows, people who are blocking a gate at Berkeley so that people can't come in and out. And, you know, a group that bangs on a window and then disappears, you know, maybe the police couldn't get there in time and we can have an interesting debate about that. But a group that's sitting in front of a gate for days and days, everybody knows they're there. What do you think is leading to the hesitation by university leaders to say, hey, this is why I've got campus cops?
Look, I don't think there's a hesitation. I have had the pleasure of clearing out parts of campuses because folks were sitting down there and they were trespassing. You could find ways of getting rid of people doing stupid things, but you don't do stupid things to get rid of them. That's the problem. You have to find that balance. I have closed down Black Panther organizations on a campus just because they were threatening other folks. And the answer is you don't do that, period. But if they're not threatening other folks, you can't shut them down just because you don't like them. That's the problem. It's a very complicated thing. And public universities are just, it's a different ball of wax because you got to deal with 5,000 different constituencies. Private universities are a little less constrained, but not that much less constrained.
I would suggest to the people who are here today, because I'm sure many of you sit on university boards or are involved with your own universities, that you can have the most impact in that position because the presidents work for you. And the presidents will only feel as empowered to close down this kind of behavior, to make the proper statements in the proper times, as you back them up to do. So give your college presidents spine, let them know that you support them when they want to do the right thing, and then you're going to see more willingness to shut down things that shouldn't be happening, to remove people who shouldn't be on campus, and so forth.
So Kerry, let me follow up on that because we've been focusing mostly on things that are happening on campus that are bad and that we don't want. But there's a lot of room for making good things happen that we want to happen. And I think it's sort of widely believed that universities are in the education business. We're fighting a disease known as ignorance. And while ignorance will never be defeated, it arises in every generation to destroy us. We can do our level best, and we're not free to desist from the work. So my question is, if we think that American universities should be doing more to teach about what's really happening in Israel, to teach about what is anti-Semitism, how is it manifesting, what can be done about it, how does it compare with and contrast from other incidences of hatred in America and in the globe. What, as a practical matter, can colleges and universities in America be doing to get that more education to actually be happening, in addition to trying to stop bad stuff, of course?
Well, I'll jump in on that. First of all, after 10/7, AJC ramped up by the way, at the beginning, when I came here, I wasn't intending to really do the full-on plug, but since every other organization has, I'm going to tell you.
He cannot help himself.
I can't help myself. After 10/7, we ramped up the work that we do on universities. You ask a really important question. To your point, first of all, it's absolutely true that for all of you who serve, who are committed to your universities, you serve on university boards, you serve on boards of trustees, your regents, your donors, there is real power in working together. We've been organizing that community since 10/7. But then the question is, what do you do with that? So first of all, for university presidents, we have been conducting trainings for university presidents, for provosts, for deans of student life. We've been taking, until 10/7, last year we took 4 groups to Israel. We think it's really important. But since 10/7, we've done a number of trainings on what anti-Semitism is, on helping them understand what the Jewish community actually is, putting them in the best position to know how to respond and what questions to ask. That's one thing that every university president can do. We've worked with DEI offices at universities to make sure that they're understanding how all of what's happening in Israel and Israel's war against Hamas is impacting Jewish students. That's another thing you can do. But going forward, there are some basic things. Starting with the fact that it's not too much, especially for those of you involved in your universities, to expect that the Jewish Studies Department and that the Israel Studies Department, if there is one, and certainly the Middle East Studies Department, that they're not all run by anti-Zionists. That's a really helpful step for people to take. We created all sorts of resources for universities to conduct curriculum audits, to make sure that, again, the hard conversations that all of you have talked about that I think are so important can actually happen because you have a diversity, you have a diverse viewpoint that's represented, that it's not just anti-Israel, hard left professors who are driving the day, but that you actually have people who understand the facts of what's happening, and that universities acknowledge that seeking out those professors who can speak to what's happening to the Jewish community, to the history of the Jewish community, to the history of Israel, is actually beneficial for those campuses.
Other thoughts on what we can be doing?
So the recipe is really pretty simple. You start with faculty, and you go out and you hire committed, thoughtful, serious scholars who are interested in these subjects, who do not come in trying to indoctrinate students, who have very thoughtful approaches to these topics. And you encourage them and their academic programs to offer courses that will draw students. And if you have great teachers, you will get students taking those courses. In addition to that, beyond the formal academic offerings, there is a broad range of informal co-curricular programming, speakers, sponsors, symposia that any institution can work with departments or even fund themselves to make happen. But it's a straightforward way.
Let me comment on something less straightforward. I've been on the board of the America-Israel Friendship Week for about 30 years, and we sponsor students going back and forth to Israel and coming to the United States, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. It got more complicated after 10/7, but we're going to do it again. But these are kids. We're sponsoring high school kids. And I think the best thing a university can do to win the hearts and minds of kids and students is to start early. So we have been helping AAFL send kids over. We host them when they come back to the United States on our campuses. We work with Hebrew University, we work with University of Tel Aviv. That's how we, at this university, the universities I work with, can really have an influence on our own university, because once we get those kids tuned up, they might even come to be our students. And those students are the most influential people on campus.
Well, and
One last very
Please.
simple one. Endow professorships of history of Israel.
so if anybody wants to endow a professorship, I'd be thrilled to have it. And I will, just to follow up on Alan's point, the Hillel at Mizzou, I can't remember who the source of funds was, but there was one of the national funders was giving money to various Hillels to take a group of students to Israel, and they were very clear, don't take a plane full exclusively of Jews. Like, please find the most committed, most involved, non-Jewish students on your campus who are willing to go. Of course, you can take. We're not saying it has to be a Jew-free airplane. Feel free to bring, your Hillel president or whatever it is. And I know some of the students who went, and it was a very, very eye-opening experience for them. And I would say that for the students today, it has to be a trip that doesn't look like we're trying to hide the ball from them, right? Like if they go on a trip and they don't meet any Israeli Arabs, or they don't meet anyone who's unhappy with the situation in Israel, they're not going to think it's real. Now, fortunately, if there's anybody who likes complaining about Israel, it's Israelis. And so, just like Americans are good at complaining about our government, so it's not actually hard to run a trip that gives a diversity of perspectives. The money point I appreciate, right? And your point of building it and they will come and so on. I'm teaching at a university that doesn't have more Jewish students than Brandeis has students, that doesn't have more students than Queens and so on. And a tremendous amount of the attention of the media, of summits like this, when people talk about American higher education, they're thinking about 20 schools, most of which are an easy train ride from Washington and New York, and then one or two of them are in California, and then maybe people have heard of the University of Chicago or Michigan or something like that. The overwhelming bulk of American college students are educated at schools that accept basically anybody who applies who has a high school degree. The overwhelming bulk of American college students go to schools where there are not a lot of Jewish students. And those people are going to grow up to have all sorts of interesting and important jobs in all the 50 states. And I'm wondering what thoughts you all have at places where nobody bothers to bring their presidents to a congressional hearing to yell at them because nobody could find those schools on a map in a congresswoman's office in Washington. What thoughts do you have for the southeast Missouri states of the world, or Cornell College in Iowa as opposed to the Cornell in New York?
Well, I'll jump in. First, we have AJC, in partnership with Hillel and the American Council on Education, is holding it's our second summit on anti-Semitism for university presidents, and we're not limiting it to only certain colleges. So we would encourage all of those university presidents to join us in Washington this fall. That's number one. Number two, I should say the flip side of that is, you're right, there are lots of colleges that don't get a lot of attention, but the idea, I want to be clear about something, the idea that the problem, the challenges that Jewish students are facing on campus is limited to a handful of schools that get a lot of attention. I
didn't mean to imply that the only problems are at a dozen places. I just mean no one's talking about those places.
So I met with a senator last week from a Midwestern state, and I walked into his office and he had pennants from all of the colleges and universities in his state. I had heard of 3. And one of them has a large Jewish population, as a matter of fact. But for the others, he was interested in doing something back home in the state to raise these issues, the kind of trainings that we do, that other organizations do, to help people understand, again, what the Jewish community is, what anti-Semitism is. It benefits not just those places with large Jewish communities, it benefits everywhere, because, last word on this, when there's anti-Semitism, I've made this point at the UN, and it's the same analysis. Whether there are a lot of Jews in your country or on your campus, or there are none at all, if there is anti-Semitism, it suggests a much deeper problem that has to be addressed, and the way to address that is through education, and we don't ignore any college.
Let me comment. What we do, and what I've done, is take college presidents from truly obscure places and take them to Israel. And that has been transformative of a lot of these places, because the college presidents come back and they are informed and they lobby for Israel. They lobby for interaction with Israel. They don't believe that Israel is an alien place because they've embraced it. And that's how you really influence people. People got to know. You can't blame people for being ignorant. You have to understand how to educate them. And one of the things we're dealing with is ignorance, because people just don't know what they don't know. So finding ways of bringing these college presidents from the middle of nowhere, and there's a lot of nowhere in this country, over to Israel is transformative of those people and therefore of their institutions.
So I'm going to call on Steve in 1 second, and after Steve makes the remarks he's been ready to make, we're going to take some questions from the audience. So whoever's in charge of microphones, start thinking about how to get the microphones to the right people. Steve.
2 quick points. These are profoundly important questions. We've heard from other speakers today about how deeply rooted anti-Semitism is. It's always been here, and we have to keep fighting against it. Because this issue is so important, we need to be tackling it educationally. But we also saw a great example earlier today of a K-12 oriented way of bringing education and expertise to units and areas of the state that maybe don't have the large Jewish population. There's no way that we can't take advantage of distance learning and things that we've got better at doing post-COVID to bring in outside speakers, because they don't necessarily have to fly. You can do it through Zoom. You can do it through prepared programs like we just saw, and that's how you tackle these important questions.
All right, so the microphone was just delivered, so you're first.
I'll get right to the point. Why is nobody talking about DEI right now and the curriculum that is going through every single solitary college campus, which is anti-Semitic because it puts Israel as the oppressor?
Let me comment on that. That is incorrect. DEI, when done appropriately, is against discrimination, period. Okay? It's against everybody who discriminates against anybody. And what it tries to do is inform, especially the faculty, because the faculty are sometimes the problem, that this is not what you do. You don't go and you take a student who happens to be Jewish in your class and make an example of them. You don't take anybody who happens to be different, whether they're transgender or gay, and make an example of them. You just don't do it. There are a lot of people who don't understand that. These are faculty members who are ignorant. And DEI is designed to affect that group of people. The problem is it's not always done correctly. The idea of getting rid of it is bad, because we got some problems. What one needs to do is do it properly.
I want to just jump in, just to be clear about that. And I actually think this is an important debate, and it's a huge debate in the Jewish community, and I'm happy to participate in it. But as long as DEI is operating, I want to make sure that the Jewish students aren't left out. The problem on some campuses, the problem on some campuses with DEI is that the DEI officers, and we know this, we've done trainings across the country on this. This is not, I think this will sound familiar to a lot of you. We're told, the initial response is, well, Judaism's a religion, we don't really deal with religion, so we're not going to talk about Jews. Well, it's a failure to understand what the Jewish community is. Secondly, they'll say, well, my goal is to really, I've had conversations like this. Well, we want to make sure that every group is included, especially marginalized groups. And Jews, you're white and you've been successful. This is not meant with any ill intent. This is the way they view it. And so there's not really a place for the Jewish community here. Again, for the Jewish kids on those campuses, or the Jewish employees, frankly, in the corporations whose DEI officers are taking the same position, we come in and do trainings to help them understand who the Jewish community is and why it's important to not be excluded from these conversations as long as you're going to be engaging in this work.
Well, and to the questioner's point, I mean, I'm a member of a group called the Academic Engagement Network that includes faculty all over the country. And when we have our meetings, there's no shortage of people who talk about how they wrote some op-ed in favor of Israel, and then people reported them to the DEI office and so on. And when those officers are well run, the response to a complaint like that is, she's allowed to say whatever she wants in the op-ed, and I'm not going to do anything to her on behalf of the institution. But of course, it's not always well run. And I know we could talk about DEI, and I would be glad to during the cocktail hour forever, but I want to make sure that we call on at least a few more people, and then we can come back to it. There's someone okay, we got someone holding the microphone in the white dress, and then you in the back. I know you've been waiting, so you're the next one after the, Go ahead.
I was on a board up at Harvard University, the Women's Leadership Board at the Kennedy School, which I'm no longer a member of. Anti-Semitism has been brewing at Harvard for a very long time. Whenever they had Israeli ambassadors come to speak or whatever, the hostility which allowed to go on against whether it's the professors or the speakers was unimaginable initially. What happened after October 7th at Harvard didn't happen in a vacuum. You have a lot of professors who are against Israel, who preach against Israel, who preach against the Jews, who preach against Zionism. What are you going to do about those professors that are still at those schools?
Yeah, well, so, and I think that's an important question, and I want to add to it before turning it over. Harvard, in the not-too-distant past, has had Larry Summers and Larry Bacow as president, and neither of those men dislikes Jews. I mean, they might dislike a few individual Jews, but they're both in favor of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, and surely they were aware of what's going on. So how is it that despite the leadership of these pro-Israel, philo-Semitic people, we're seeing the problems we have?
You know, I think the answer here is you got to call out and expose the fallacies and the flawed reasoning and the lies when people make them. And that extends to students in a classroom, it extends to faculty. So we all need to work on having actually the courage to call out shoddy scholarship, flawed reasoning, and name it for what it is.
But beyond that, you also have to have someone who can be there to do that, right? You have to have that balance on your faculty, which is why I'm saying I think that donors and people who are influential, alumni who participate in these kinds of advisory boards and so forth, need to say that diversity of ideology is just as important as other kinds of diversity. And at Harvard in particular, DEI, to your point, simply was silent and excluded the protection of Jewish students and other religions. And I would say, from my experience as a college president, that absolutely different religious minorities need to be protected in an environment, in a university. And so that was a mistake. And I think that we will need to cultivate that broader range of voices if we want to counter the kinds of rhetoric that you're talking about. But it is a place where people can express their views, but there need to be opposing views.
I was on the faculty of the Kennedy School. I was on the faculty of Kennedy School. And let me just say that there are real assholes at Harvard on the faculty as well, okay? Some of them were hired before assholes were labored.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Wait.
Well,
Right. Can I?
what you have to do, I think, and this is the purpose of a lot of the DEI offices, is to educate these people, because some of them are educable. Not all of them, because some of them are just real crazy, but some of them are educable. And you have to spend time trying to educate these folks. But when they have tenure, it is very difficult, unless they commit a crime, to get rid of them.
And I'm going to call on someone in the back who's been
Wait,
extremely patient.
Hold on one second.
She hasn't been patient enough. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But I just want to say, again, we're on lots. We interact with administrators and university presidents across the country, and I understand what tenure is, and I understand that it makes it difficult. But when university professors are giving extra credit if you go to the Hamas march, or university professors are singling out Jewish kids in the classroom, that may not be a crime, but it is inconsistent with what the university is supposed to be doing. It puts those Jewish kids at risk, and universities have to address it.
Correct.
All right.
Correct.
It is your turn.
Okay. I think that we can all agree on one thing in this room today. If we were in a movie theater and it was dark and I stood up and screamed the word fire, would I be breaking the law? I think we all know the answer is yes. There is a difference. Words matter. There is a difference, a fundamental, simple morality issue here. Words matter. There's a difference between hate speech that incites craziness, unlawfulness, disregard of property, personal safety, and free speech. I do not believe, and you cannot convince me, that screaming the words "from the river to the sea" is an innocuous comment and it should be ignored. I do not believe, and I will not support, this kind of, oh, well, they're just kids, they don't know any better. I don't know why it's so hard for grown-ups in this country where we live in freedom to understand the fundamental difference between hate speech and free speech. And if any one of you want to take that on, go for it.
I'm happy to go for it. So I teach at the University of Missouri, and in 2015, I became chair of what we call the Faculty Council, and almost every other university in America calls the Faculty Senate, and that was a punishment for me missing a meeting, I think. And in the fall of that year, our president and our system president and campus chancellor resigned on the same day, that November, in response to protests related to racial issues. And it was a very complicated problem, and we had big issues about free speech. And the interim chancellor who got put in, he and I appointed a committee to help write rules having to do with free speech, protests, and so on our campus. And as a public university, we're covered by the First Amendment, of course, and we also have a Missouri state statute that's very strongly pro-free speech. And I would say it actually is often quite difficult to figure out what is ordinary stupidity that we can merely condemn, and what is the sort of conduct violation that we can punish someone for. And to pick an example that is not directly related to the hot button issue we're thinking of right now, we have black students who have complained that there are people who make white racist slogans or white supremacist slogans when they're walking around. And the lawyers will tell you, if you go talk to people who are educated on the First Amendment, that we are not allowed to kick students out of the University of Missouri for being members of white supremacist organizations or going to Richard Spencer's march at, say, when he spoke at the University of Florida. The University of Florida was not allowed to prevent him from marching in Gainesville, and it cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars for the security and so on. So I think these questions are extremely complicated. And so this is not to defend for a minute the performance of the university presidents at that hearing that everyone is talking about. We can all say that they didn't answer questions with the kind of moral clarity that we would have wished. But the idea that it is actually easy to decide whether students, for example, who say "from the river to the sea" at a march, it's very different if they come to some Jewish kid's dormitory and start yelling it. But people who make marches, if Chinese students are marching and say that they own Taiwan, that could be seen as a threat to Taiwanese people, but probably would not allow us to kick those students out of the university. So I think it's hard.
I'm just going to add one thing. Here's what's not hard. Here's what's not hard about this. Free speech rights, and this is, for us, this is the most important thing we always try to get universities to acknowledge. The free speech rights that we spend so much time, where universities spend so much time worrying about statements that don't certainly seem, I agree, that are more than just speech. But still, free speech rights debate is important. But you know what we can all agree? University presidents also enjoy that free speech right. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. University presidents set the tone for what happens on campus. And if you're telling me, if you're telling me, because this is great, by the way. If you're telling me
why they paid their money.
If you're telling me that students can march calling for the annihilation of Jews, but university presidents can't stand up and condemn that, one, I don't believe it, and two, we should change that.
That is not true. You have to, at a public university, you have to remember that the university president is a public employee.
So what?
They have to be very careful not to exercise free speech because we don't have it. University presidents at public universities do not have the right to free speech. Faculty members have, the university president doesn't. We can call out hate speech, but we are protected by the law that says this is hate speech. But we cannot go and put our own spin on what hate speech is. It's very difficult. So we want legislation. We try to get You can't get anything through Congress, but you try to get it through the state legislature. This is hate speech. And then we can do something about it. But you have to be careful because other people will say, make America great again is hate speech. And that is in fact true.
I think when Ben
hold on.
Sass, no, Ben
got people
Sass is the
desperate.
president. Ben Sass is the president of the flagship university in the state of Florida, and after 10/7, he could not have spoken with any greater moral clarity about what happened. That's what I'm suggesting. Every university president can do that.
We got a question in the back.
Hi, I'm a parent of a college student here in UCF. Also involved with the Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism and Run for Their Lives. I cannot fathom the idea that someone blocking a classroom or blocking traffic to get to class is allowed to do that. Why aren't they taking accountability at the schools to stop it? If I were to stand in front of a professor's door and not let anybody in, I'd be arrested.
Well, and I'm with you 100% on this, right? And when I say things are hard, some things are hard, but not everything is hard, right? If you are impeding people's lawful access to a building, that's not allowed, and the university should get rid of you. And so I can't speak to the current administration of that school, and I'm not an expert on what they're doing. But any other follow-up?
I'll echo the same thing. Absolutely. You're disrupting somebody's ability to get to class. You're banging on the walls. You're blocking the entrances. Punishable offense. And if institutions are unwilling to do that, they should step up and have some steel in their spine. On the other hand, I'm in a class and I say something that is profoundly disturbing to somebody that they don't want to hear because it's an idea that is distressing, that's allowed. At some point, that expressing an idea gets dangerously close to expressing a threat, a personal hatred to you. That's where you get into the hard questions. But knocking on the door, blocking the entryway, that's not a hard question.
And the answer to how come something isn't being done, and again, I know nothing about the specific incident you're talking about, but in general, is that not everyone in the world is good at their jobs, right? And so I think part of the benefit of a group like this and part of the benefit of people who have influence on trustees is that when people aren't doing what they're supposed to do, they should be held accountable, and people should be calling that university's trustees or that university's president and say, maybe you didn't hear about this incident, what are you going to do about it? We have thousands of universities in this country, and those thousands of universities have hundreds of thousands collectively of professors. You're going to find people who are professors who do crazy things the same way you're going to find cops who do bad things and members of Congress who do bad things, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all cops or all of Congress should be put in the trash. And so I think it's useful to have a balance of saying when people mess up, we need to pay attention because we can't pretend it's not a problem, while also acknowledging that the American system of higher education has been pretty good for the Jews for a very long time. We have a question. Yeah, I see you there. I'm looking right at you. Well, just stand up and use the big voice.
I'm still pretty good at math, and I think 1 and 1 equals 2. This morning we heard from the Lawfare Project about the billions of dollars that are being pumped into schools and suggesting that they're influencing the outcomes. From your perspective, from the college, what do you think about that? Can that be stopped? I know we're all addicted to money. Can that be stopped?
Let me comment on that from a public university point of view. The Chinese spend more money than the Qataris, for sure. It's not even close, okay? And what we have been able to do is to find out where the influence is and shut it down. The Qataris are not giving money to the universities to be anti-Israel. They're endowing professorships, they're giving scholarships, they're doing all this kind of stuff. It's very difficult to monitor that, but when you find it, you can get rid of it. But you have to be very careful because the Qataris also fund a scholarship at one institution, a fellowship, an endowed professorship and a fellowship that are pro-Israel. I mean, they're not stupid people. They're not just going to fund one side or the other. They're going to have their influence all over the place. So, yes, we can do something about it, but we got to know what we're doing.
All right, other answers to this question.
I would just say that I would say in the past decade, universities were very blind to the attempts at foreign influence through funding that were going on really just in plain sight. And especially, as you say, the Chinese were blatant in this regard. And I think now, because of that, because of the Chinese example, universities are becoming more aware and more careful about that kind of foreign influence. But there's all kinds of outside influence that occurs. There's a lot of online influence by foreign governments that also stoke some of these demonstrations and attitudes on campus. And so we need to be mindful of that, and we need to be thinking about how do you counter that kind of foreign interference on your campuses.
I was just really quickly, I was on Capitol Hill last week, and I had a really interesting conversation with a couple of members of Congress who are in the context of this broader, or this specific conversation rather, about post-10/7 and what's happening on college campuses, are now looking at it's not just comparing China to Qatar to the other countries. They're now looking and saying, well, wait a second, on the one hand, if you look at the total amount of dollars going to universities through grants and through research dollars from the US and through tax exempt, for no taxes on the gains on these massive endowments and no real estate taxes, and charitable contributions for the contributions that go to universities. The ledger, on the one hand, between American taxpayer dollars that are funding American universities and the money coming from abroad, there is so much. They're now suggesting and looking at. There's so much money that we are all contributing to every university in America, prompting them to ask the question, maybe we should ask why foreign money is coming in at all.
So I'm told we have time for exactly one last question, and you're going to get to ask it, and we might not all answer it, so we'll see how many answers we need.
No, I think I'd like to address this to Ted specifically.
Please.
And we're all looking for solutions here, and you're all part of the solution, so I think we all thank you. But
does that make me the problem?
Well, I'll get there. But I think you've got the background, given your background, to answer this. Some boards, some trustees don't have a leadership, period. But we did see with a congressional hearing a tremendous outcome, even though it was based upon plagiarism. But the results were very clear. They couldn't testify, they couldn't hold their ground, and they were wrong to being where they were. To be able to have movement on this, is it a congressional role? Should it be, and if so, how? It sounds like it's the only point of accountability still left to see significant progress. I'm told there'll be some new hearings again next month, but should there be legislation on top of hearings?
Well, first of all, let's not understate the importance of the hearings. We talked about I referenced the one with the university presidents. The hearings that Congress has had with students has been very powerful. And making a record of this moment, I know we're all in it. Everyone here thinks about this all the time. But for Congress to make a record of what's going on to refer back to, that matters a lot. In terms of legislation, I don't know where they're going to go with this. I had some conversations about FERPTA, right? Because we have these codes of student conduct. We have no idea if they're being enforced because of FERPTA rules. Well, maybe they should look at those rules in the context of what's been exposed since 10/7. I mean, and then on the funding issue, as I said, there's now a conversation about funding and where it comes from. And given the massive amount of money that flows to college campuses through federal dollars appropriated by the United States Congress, I think what a lot of my former colleagues in Congress have now caught on to is that the leverage that they hold to make sure that universities are taking this as seriously as they need to is immense, and I think they intend to use it.
All right, well, so I'm about to wrap us up, and I'll just give one parting thought that I think we should all be careful in quickly joining a group that wants to take a bunch of funding away from the universities that we hope will educate our children and cure disease in the future. And so hopefully we can chew gum and walk at the same time and make things better without concurrently making things worse. I want to thank the summit for hosting us. I want to thank my fellow panelists for being here and everyone in the audience for paying attention. Thank you so much. Thank you.
On behalf of the synagogue, we would like to honor all the panelists with a beautiful Megillas Esther, the book of Esther that we'll be reading this Saturday night. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go into a small coffee break before our next discussion. So please feel free to go to the back and get yourself a drink.